You're listening to the Radio Fictional Stories. What I'm about to share with you happened 3 months ago, during what the military called the Dark Sky Protocol. Most people think it was just another government cover-up, but I was there. I lived through it. And tonight, I'm not alone in telling this story. The year was 2024, and the world had been dealing with something they called the Silent Harvest for nearly 2 months. Every night, people would go to sleep and simply not wake up, not dead, just gone, vanished without a trace. The official reports said it was affecting roughly 1 in 8 people globally, but those of us who lived through it know the real numbers were much higher. I'm Richard Radio, broadcasting from what used to be the abandoned town of Millbrook, about 200 miles north of Denver. I was a telecommunications engineer before all this started, working for a company that maintained emergency broadcast systems. That's how I ended up here, and that's how I met the 2 people who are with me tonight, Sarah. Are you ready to share your part of the story?
Thanks, Richard. I'm Sarah Chen, and I was an Army Communications specialist stationed at Fort Carson when the Dark Sky Protocol began. People need to understand, this wasn't some random phenomenon. The military knew something was coming. 3 days before the first public reports of disappearances, we received classified orders to establish what they called safe zone protocols. In remote locations across the country, I was part of a team sent to set up emergency communications in Millbrook. The town had been mostly abandoned since the mining industry collapsed in the 1990s. But it had something special, a natural electromagnetic field that seemed to interfere with whatever was causing the disappearances. The night I arrived in Millbrook, I was traveling with a convoy of 12 soldiers and 3 civilian contractors. We set up our base in the old community center, a solid brick building that had weathered decades of Colorado winters. The plan was simple: establish communication links with other safe zones and monitor the situation. But Richard, you want to tell them about that first night. You were already here when we arrived.
I was, Sarah. I'd been in Millbrook for about a week before the military convoy showed up. I came here because my supervisor, a man named Marcus Webb, had sent me to investigate reports of communication anomalies in the area. What he didn't tell me was that his own wife had been taken 3 nights earlier. Marcus was a practical man, not given to superstition, but he'd noticed something in the data we'd been collecting from emergency broadcast stations. There were patterns in the static, frequencies that seemed to correspond with the disappearances. I remember the night Marcus called me. His voice was shaking. I'd never heard him like that before. He said, "Richard, I need you to go to Millbrook. Take the portable communication equipment and see if you can establish a clean signal from there. And Richard ... don't sleep alone. Whatever you do, don't sleep alone." I thought he was having a breakdown. I mean, who wouldn't after losing their spouse? But I took the assignment anyway. The drive to Millbrook took me through 5 different towns, and in each one I saw the same thing: missing person posters covering every available surface, people walking around in groups, nobody alone, everyone looking exhausted. When I got to Millbrook, it was like stepping into a different world. The town was quiet, but it was a natural quiet, not the terrified silence I'd been driving through. I set up my equipment in the old radio station building on Main Street. It still had functional power, thanks to a small hydroelectric generator. That had been maintained by the last few residents. That's when I started picking up the signals.
The signals Richard is talking about, we detected them too, but from a military perspective. Command had given us very specific instructions about what to do if we encountered certain frequency patterns. They called it Contact Protocol 7. The first night we were in Millbrook, around 2:30 a.m., every piece of electronic equipment we had started picking up the same transmission. It wasn't words, exactly. It was more like, have you ever heard someone trying to speak underwater? That's the closest I can describe it. My team leader, Sergeant Rodriguez, was a 20-year veteran. He'd served in Afghanistan, Iraq, and had seen things that would break most people. But when those transmissions started coming through, I watched him go completely pale. He grabbed the radio and tried to contact base, but all we got was static. The weird thing was, none of the local people seemed affected. There was still a small population in Millbrook, maybe 30 or 40 people who had stayed behind when the mining company left. They were mostly older folks, some who had lived there their whole lives, and they were sleeping peacefully while we were dealing with these transmissions. That's when we realized Millbrook wasn't just a random safe zone. It was protected somehow. But let me tell you about the night everything changed. Marcus, do you want to take this part?
Actually, Sarah, I think Richard should continue. I wasn't there for the beginning. I arrived later after I lost everyone else.
Marcus is the third person with me tonight, and his story connects to both mine and Sarah's in ways we're still trying to understand. But you're right, Marcus. Let me tell them about the night everything changed out. It was our 5th night in Millbrook. Sarah's team had established a routine. They'd monitor communications during the day, and at night, they'd set up a watch system. Nobody slept alone, just like Marcus had warned me. I was working in the radio station, trying to clean up some of the transmissions we'd been recording when I heard Sarah's voice over the emergency channel. She was trying to stay calm, but I could hear the panic underneath. All units, this is Communications Base Millbrook. We have a Code 7 situation. Multiple contacts, unknown origin, requesting immediate backup. I grabbed my portable radio and ran toward the community center. The night was completely silent. No insects, no wind, nothing. Even my footsteps seemed muffled. As I got closer to the building, I could see strange lights flickering in the windows, but not like electric. Lights. These were moving, pulsing, almost like they were alive. Sarah, you were inside. What was happening?
We were being tested. Richard, that's the only way I can describe it. It started around 11 p.m. Rodriguez was on first watch, and I was trying to get some sleep on one of the cots we'd set up. Suddenly, every piece of equipment in the room started making noise at once. Radios, phones, even our digital watches. It was like something was trying to communicate through every electronic device simultaneously. Then the lights started, not the room lights. Those went out immediately. These were different. They moved like living things, circling around us, and wherever they touched, the air got cold. I mean, really cold. I could see my breath, and this was July in Colorado. Rodriguez started shouting orders, but his voice sounded wrong. It was like hearing him through water, distorted and echoing. I tried to respond, but when I opened my mouth, no sound came out. It was like something was stealing our voices. That's when I saw them. They weren't solid, not like people. They were more like shadows that had learned to move independently. They were surrounding us, and I could feel them trying to get inside my head. They were showing me things, memories that weren't mine, places I'd never been, people I'd never met. I saw a woman in a bedroom, reaching up toward something I couldn't see, her face frozen in terror. I saw children in a basement, huddled together while something moved in the darkness above them. I saw thousands of people, all reaching upward, all being pulled toward something beyond the ceiling, beyond the sky. And then I understood. This wasn't random. They were taking people to somewhere else, somewhere that exists parallel to our world, but slightly, shifted. Like a radio frequency that's almost, but not quite in tune.
I got to the community center just as Sarah was experiencing this. From the outside, I could see the building was completely dark, but there were these moving lights inside, and I could hear what sounded like voices. But they weren't quite human voices. I tried the front door, but it wouldn't open. Not locked. It was like the door had become part of the wall. So I went around to the back, where there was a window that was partially open. As I climbed through, everything went quiet. Inside, I could see Sarah and her team, but they were completely still, like they were frozen in time. Sarah was standing in the middle of the room with her arms outstretched, and her face Her face was looking up at something I couldn't see, but her expression was one of complete terror. The other soldiers were in similar positions, all looking up, all reaching toward something. And floating around them were these shadow things. Sarah described. They were moving in patterns, like they were performing some kind of ritual. I tried to call out to Sarah, but like she said, no sound came out. That's when I realized the only way to help was to use the radio equipment. I started broadcasting on every frequency I could find, sending out a signal that I hoped would interfere with whatever was happening. And it worked. The shadow things turned toward me, and I could feel them trying to get into my head too. But I kept broadcasting, kept sending out that signal, and slowly, one by one, Sarah and her team started to move again.
When I came back to myself, it was like waking up from the worst nightmare of my life. But the nightmare was real, and it was still happening. Rodriguez and 2 other soldiers weren't responding. They were still frozen, still reaching upward, and I could see that they were starting to fade, not disappear, but become translucent. Like they were being pulled into that other dimension I'd seen in the visions. Richard was still broadcasting, and I could hear his signal cutting through the static that filled the room. I grabbed the emergency radio and started broadcasting on military frequencies, sending out a distress call that I hoped someone, somewhere, would hear. That's when Marcus's voice came through the radio.
I was about 50 miles away when I heard Sarah's transmission. I'm Dr. Marcus Webb, and I was Richard's supervisor at the telecommunications company. But I wasn't just a supervisor. I was part of a classified research project that had been monitoring these disappearances since they started. See, the government knew about this phenomenon long before it became public. We'd been detecting the frequency anomalies for months, tracking them as they moved across the country. We knew they were connected to the disappearances, but we didn't know how to stop them. When my wife was taken, I wasn't just a grieving husband. I was a researcher who had access to classified data about what was really happening. I knew that certain locations, places with specific electromagnetic properties, seemed to offer protection. Millbrook was one of them. I'd been driving toward Millbrook when I heard Sarah's distress call. I was part of a team that had been tasked with studying these safe zones, but I was also someone who had lost everything and was desperate to find answers. When I got to Millbrook, I found Richard and Sarah in the community center, trying to keep Rodriguez and the other soldiers from completely fading away. They were still there, but barely. You could see through them, and they weren't responding to anything. I had equipment with me, specialized frequency generators that we'd been developing to interfere with the anomalies. Richard, do you remember what happened when we first tried to use them?
I remember, Marcus. You set up these devices that looked like a cross between a radio and some kind of medical equipment. You said they were designed to broadcast on frequencies that would create a barrier between our dimension and wherever these things were coming from. When you turned them on, the effect was immediate. The shadow things that had been circling around Rodriguez and the others suddenly pulled back like they'd been hit by something. The air in the room got warmer, and for the first time in hours, we could speak normally. But Rodriguez and the others, they were still fading. Marcus said the connection had been active too long, that they were already too far gone. We had maybe minutes before they would be completely pulled into the other dimension. Sarah, you came up with the idea that saved them.
It was something I remembered from my communications training. When you're trying to establish contact with someone who's on a weak signal, sometimes you can boost the connection by creating a signal bridge, using multiple transmitters to amplify the signal and bring them back into range. I realized that Rodriguez and the others weren't gone yet. They were just displaced, like they were on a frequency we couldn't quite reach. So I suggested we try to create a bridge back to our reality using multiple radio transmitters. We gathered every piece of communication equipment we could find: radios, phones, even an old CB radio from one of the abandoned houses. We set them, all to broadcast on the same frequency, creating a kind of electronic beacon. Marcus, you were the one who figured out the right frequency to use.
The frequency was 156.8 MHz. It was one of the patterns we'd been tracking in the research project. We'd noticed that this specific frequency seemed to be present whenever someone was taken, but we'd never tried broadcasting on it ourselves. When we started transmitting, the effect was incredible. Rodriguez and the others started to become solid again, and they began responding to our voices. But we also realized we were doing something dangerous. By broadcasting on that frequency, we were opening a door between dimensions, and we weren't. Sure, we could control what came through. That's when the real contact began. The shadow things weren't just random entities. They were scouts, sent ahead to identify people who could be taken safely. But when we started broadcasting on their frequency, we caught their attention in a way that had never happened before. We could hear them trying to communicate, not in words, but in concepts, images, emotions. They were trying to tell us something about their world, about why they were taking people. Richard, you were the first one to understand what they were trying to say.
It took me a while to piece it together, but eventually I realized they weren't hostile. They were desperate. Their dimension was dying. Something had gone wrong in their reality, and they needed living consciousness to survive. They weren't taking people to hurt them. They were taking people to save both their world and ours. But they were doing it wrong. They were creating a connection that was too strong, too permanent. The people they took couldn't survive in their dimension, and the process was destroying both realities. What they needed was a way to create a temporary bridge, a way to share consciousness without destroying either world. And that's what we accidentally created when we started broadcasting on their frequency. Over the next several hours, we worked with them to establish a communication protocol. We used the radio equipment to create a stable connection that allowed for communication without the dangerous displacement effects. Sarah, you want to tell them about the first real conversation we had?
It was the strangest experience of my life. We were sitting in the community center, all of our equipment tuned to the same frequency, and suddenly we could hear them clearly, not voices, exactly, but thoughts that we could understand. They told us their world had been connected to ours for much longer than we realized. Every time someone disappeared without explanation, every time someone reported seeing shadows or hearing voices, it was because the barrier between worlds was breaking down. They said they'd been trying to fix it from their side, but they needed help from our side too. The people they'd taken weren't gone forever. They were being held in a kind of suspended state while they tried to figure out how to send them back safely. But the process was taking too long, and both worlds were starting to suffer. They needed to find a way to create stable communication points, places where the two realities could interact without causing damage. That's why Millbrook was safe. The natural electromagnetic field created a buffer that allowed for communication, without the dangerous displacement effects. There were other places like it around the world, but not many. They asked us to help them establish more communication points, to create a network that would stabilize the connection between worlds, and allow them to return the people they'd taken.
What they were asking us to do was essentially create a permanent communication network between dimensions. Using the classified equipment I had access to, combined with Richard's telecommunications expertise and Sarah's military communication training, we could establish stable contact points in other locations. But there was a catch. Someone had to stay at each contact point to monitor the connection and make sure it remained stable. It was dangerous work. Constant exposure to the interdimensional energy could have unpredictable effects on human consciousness. That's why we're here tonight, broadcasting this story. We've been manning the Millbrook contact point for 3 months now, and we've helped establish 17 other points around the world. Each one has allowed them to return hundreds of people who had been taken, but we're also changing. The constant exposure to their dimension is affecting us in ways we don't fully understand yet. We can see things that aren't quite in our reality, hear thoughts that aren't quite our own, remember experiences that happened in their world. We're becoming bridges ourselves, living connections between dimensions, and we don't know what that means for our future.
The reason we're telling this story now is because the Dark Sky Protocol is about to enter its final phase. The military has officially classified the entire operation, and they're planning to shut down the communication points we've established. They think the crisis is over because the disappearances have stopped, but they don't understand that we've only created a temporary solution. If they shut down the communication network, the barrier between worlds will start breaking down again, and the disappearances will resume. We've tried to explain this to them, but they don't want to hear it. They want to pretend none of this ever happened, that the disappearances were just a temporary anomaly that resolved itself. Sarah, Marcus, and I have made a decision. We're going to continue operating the communication points, regardless of what the military decides. We've learned too much, seen too much, to let both worlds slide back into crisis. But we need help. We need people who understand the importance of what we're doing. People who are willing to take on the responsibility of maintaining these connections.
If you're listening to this broadcast, and you've experienced something you can't explain, shadows that move independently, voices that speak in frequencies you feel rather than hear, dreams of places that exist parallel to our world, you might be someone who can help. The network we've established isn't just about preventing disappearances. It's about evolution, about our species learning to exist in connection with other forms of consciousness. We're not just preventing a crisis, we're participating in the next step of human development. But it's not easy work. It requires constant vigilance, and it changes you in ways that can't be undone. Marcus, Richard, and I are no longer entirely human. We exist partially in both worlds, and we can never go back to the way we were.
The people who were taken and returned, they're different too. They remember their time in the other dimension, and they can still feel the connection. Many of them have volunteered to help maintain the communication points. They understand, better than anyone, what's at stake. We're not asking everyone to make the sacrifice we've made, but we are asking people to understand that this story isn't over. The Dark Sky Protocol was just the beginning. We've opened a door between worlds, and we have a responsibility to make sure that door is used wisely. The beings in the other dimension aren't our enemies. They're our partners in a relationship that could transform both of our realities. But partnerships require trust, communication, and commitment from both sides.
So that's our story. That's what really happened during the Dark Sky Protocol. And that's what's still happening now. The official reports will tell you that the crisis ended when the disappearances stopped. But those of us who lived through it know that the real story is just beginning. We're broadcasting from Millbrook, but we won't be here much longer. The military is moving to shut down this facility, and we'll have to go underground to continue our work. But the communication network will survive, and the connection between worlds will be maintained. If you're someone who's experienced the unexplained, if you felt the call to be part of something larger than yourself, then you know how to find. U.S. Listen to the frequencies that exist between stations. Pay attention to the static that carries patterns. Look for the signals that speak to your consciousness rather than your ears. The door between worlds is open, and it's not going to close. The question is whether humanity will walk through it with wisdom and purpose, or whether we'll stumble through it blindly. Sarah, Marcus, and I have made our choice. We're going to keep the door open, keep the communication flowing, and help. Both worlds learn to coexist, but we can't do it alone. This is Richard Radio, reminding you that you've been listening to the radio ... fictional stories. But sometimes, the line between fiction and reality is thinner than we think. Keep listening to the frequencies that exist between stations. You never know what you might hear. Until next time, this is Millbrook Station, signing off.